brutal story of Jesus' crucifixion. I want to ask you a favor. Before you think about what the crucifixion means to you or for you today, could you please focus first on Jesus, on what he went through? Let's listen to the events of that day and imagine ourselves in Jesus' position. But please also listen carefully today to the other characters in this story. Each character in this story of Jesus' crucifixion experienced something about him. And today let's discover what they experienced. Let's see if we can discover something different today from the crucifixion story. Instead of just hearing what we always do. Jesus died for my sins and so God is no longer angry with me and now I'm okay. So let's begin. The Pilate Chronicles. Now, after the Passover meal, the same meal where Jesus clearly told his disciples that there was now a new covenant between God and humanity, Jesus told them that from now on, the Passover meal should be in remembrance of him. And wow, that was a strange conversation, because the Passover meal had always been about what God had done for Israel. Jesus also gave them a new command. And did Jesus think he is? Giving new commands. I mean, it's only God that can give commands. That's God's role. But Jesus comes and he says to them, he gives them a new commandment. You must love one another as I loved you. And by the way, this was before the crucifixion. I can just imagine what must have been running through the disciples' minds. It's crazy, all this talk. But in a way, it was also really exciting because for generations the Jewish people had expected that one day a king would come who would save them, and this king would reign forever. So the disciples knew something's up, something's happening, but what? I imagine they were cautiously excited. But Jesus wasn't. He was troubled. He was deeply distressed. Jesus then asked his disciples to go with him to an urban garden, the Garden of Gethsemane, to pray. They went at night so that no one would arrest them. And in the garden, Jesus asked his disciples to wait for him and pray. And then he went a bit further to pray alone. And we all know that prayer, right? That prayer that Jesus prayed, Father, you and I know what's going to happen now, but if I had a choice, I wouldn't want this to happen. But as always, it's not about my will. Let your will be done. And then he returned and found his men fast asleep. He woke them up and said, come on, guys, can't you even stay awake and pray with me? And then Judas arrived. And he slipped away during the Passover meal. And now he's here. But he didn't come alone. He came with a small army, temple guards and troops. And everyone was shocked. When Jesus gave himself over, he gave himself over to these fools. He surrendered and they were shocked. What? I mean, he's supposed to become the king now. He even predicted it himself. And the text say, then all his disciples deserted him and ran away. So the story continues. They took Jesus to the high priest's home, where the leading priests, the elders, and the teachers of the religious law had gathered. This group had never been this close to Jesus before. They had never managed to separate Jesus from the crowds. They had never looked him in the eyes from so close. They had never been in a position to reach out and touch him. And now, here he is. Jesus is in their reach. And what happened next is fascinating, with a lot of detail and for good reason. Now many people wonder, where did the gospel writers get all this detail from? I mean, the disciples had just ran away, so they weren't there. But if you read the book Acts, the book that tells the story of the early church, you'll see that some of the very men who stood around Jesus and bullied him later became his followers. Not because of what he taught, but because of what he did, his resurrection. And those were the men who told the gospel writers everything in detail. And here's what happened. Inside, the leading priest and the entire high council were trying to find evidence against Jesus so they could put him to death. But they couldn't find any. Many false witnesses spoke against him, but they contradicted each other. And to make things worse, every time they asked Jesus a direct question, he simply refused to answer. Then one of the high priests lost his temper. Then the high priest stood up before the others and asked Jesus, "Well, are you going to answer these charges? What do you have to say for yourself?" But Jesus was silent and made no reply. Then came the big question, the one they actually wanted an answer to. "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" Big question to ask. And in that moment, Jesus held both his own and your future in the palm of his hands. He looked around at the men in the room, whose motives were anything but pure, and he replied, "I am." Then the high priest tore his clothing and to show his horror and said, "Why do we need other witnesses? You have all heard his blasphemy. What is your verdict?" "Guilty," they all cried. "He deserves to die." Some began to spit on him and blindfold him. Then they struck him with their fists and cheered, "Prophesy to us." And the guards slapped him as they led him away. The men in that room then had the entire night to discuss their plans thoroughly. And while we don't know whether they were awake all night scheming, very early in the morning, the leading priests, along with the elders and the teachers of the religious law, in fact, the entire high council, met to discuss their next step. You see, they had everything lined up to declare Jesus guilty, but they still had to convince the Romans to carry out the sentence, because the temple leaders weren't allowed to execute anyone. That was against God's law. But they wanted Jesus dead, so they needed the Romans to handle that part, the execution. Their plan was to persuade Pilate to kill Jesus that same day. That way, the crowds in Jerusalem would come to their senses about Jesus and Passover celebrations could continue as usual. Basically, they wanted things to go back to normal, back to what they were comfortable with. So, they put their plan into motion. They bound Jesus and led him away and handed him over to Pilate, the Roman governor. Pilate asked Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Now, Pilate was the governor over the entire Judean region, which included Jerusalem and part of Samaria. He had ruled for about 7 years already. Now, history tells us that Pilate couldn't stand the Jews. He didn't even live in Jerusalem. He stayed in a palace near the coast and only came to Jerusalem during the big festivals, just to keep the peace. His favorite pastime was reminding the Jewish leaders how little power they actually had under the Roman rule. He loved watching them squirm under his authority. So then they took Jesus from Caiaphas to the Roman governor's headquarters. It was early morning, and they themselves didn't go inside because it would defile them, and they wouldn't be allowed to celebrate the Passover. Did you notice the hypocrisy here? They had this religious rule. You don't mix with Gentiles, people who don't believe in God. They won't even enter a Gentile's house, or otherwise they would become ritually unclean. They were so focused on staying pure, while their plan was to murder an innocent man. Sounds familiar? How often are we also so obsessed with our relationship with God? Me, me, me. And in the same breath, we're ready to crucify someone else. So Pilate came out to them and asked, "What is your charge against this man?" And of course, they had pre-prepared answers for everything. "We wouldn't have handed him over to you if he weren't a criminal." Basically, they said, "Pilate, don't worry about the details. You know us. We won't bring him here if he wasn't guilty. We're not trying to waste your time, sir. We just need a quick favor from you." And the Romans loved it when the Jews needed favors. It reinforced their dominance and control. So back to the story. "Then take him away and judge him by your own laws," Pilate told them. Pilate wanted them to beg, and he loved it. It affirmed Roman superiority. The Jews sighed because they all knew the answer to Pilate's suggestion. "Only the Romans are permitted to execute someone," the Jewish leaders replied. "Oh, Pilate, everyone knows our law says we are not allowed to kill anyone." And Pilate says, "So you need me. You don't need your God, you need me. Interesting." And then Pilate went back into his headquarters and called for Jesus to be brought to him. "Are you the king of the Jews?" he asked him. And outside, the Jewish leaders are going crazy. They know how persuasive Jesus can be. They have no idea what he was going to say to Pilate now. And they know exactly how he's gained popularity through his words and miracles. But they can't go in and listen, because then they will be unclean. And Jesus, he never had a problem hanging out with sinners. In fact, that was his favorite kind of company, sinners. So Pilate skipped straight to the juicy rumors he heard from his soldiers. He had obviously heard about this rabbi arriving in Jerusalem, and now he finally had a chance to interrogate him personally. And Pilate asked, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus replied, "Is this your own question, or did others tell you about me?" "Am I a Jew?" Pilate retorted. "Your own people and their leading priest brought you to me for trial. Why? What have you done?" As if he's saying, "Come on, Jesus, you can't deny that you're stirring things up. Just look at what's happening outside here." And Jesus answered Pilate's original question. He said, "My kingdom is not an earthly kingdom." In other words, yes, I am a king, but not like anything you have ever seen before. My kingdom is not an earthly kingdom. If it were, my followers would fight to keep me from being handed over to the Jewish leaders. But my kingdom is not of this world. Pilate, if my kingship was like the kingdoms of this world, you know exactly what would have happened. My followers would have risen up in battle. I have thousands and thousands of followers ready for action. You know how these kingdoms work. Violent, power, and the strongest one wins and rules. But Pilate, my kingdom is nothing like the empires that you are used to. Pilate then asked the obvious follow-up question. So you are a king? And later, Pilate went back outside to the crowd of Jewish leaders. I find nothing wrong with this man. But the crowd got stirred up. They kept shouting, "He's causing riots by his teachings wherever he goes, all over Judea, from Galilee to Jerusalem." And when Pilate heard that, so he's from Galilee. That's not even my jurisdiction. That's Herod's problem. Now, this Herod was the son of Herod the Great, the one who built the temple and sent soldiers to kill all the babies when he heard a new king was born, when Jesus was born. Now that Herod had died, and now his son ruled over Galilee. And coincidentally, Herod was also in Jerusalem at that time for the Passover celebration. For the Romans, Passover was one big party. So Pilate says, "Listen, Herod is just across in town. Go speak to him and see what he says." You can read the account for yourself. But Herod was excited to meet Jesus. He had heard so much about him. So he asked Jesus a bunch of questions, and Jesus didn't answer a single question he asked. Herod even asked him to do a few tricks. He heard about Jesus and his miracles, but Jesus did and said nothing. Eventually, Herod got frustrated. He mocked Jesus and he sent him back to Pilate. And then Pilate called together the leading priests and other religious leaders with the people, and he announced his verdict. "You brought this man to me, accusing him of leading a revolt. I have examined him thoroughly on this point in your presence and find him innocent." Can you hear a rebellion? No. Herod came to the same conclusion and sent him back to us. Nothing this man has done calls for the death penalty. So I will have him flogged, and then I will release him. Then a mighty roar rose from the crowd, and with one voice they shouted, "Kill him and release Barabbas to us." Barabbas was in prison for taking part of the insurrection in Jerusalem against the government and for murder. But they kept shouting, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" So Pilate had Jesus flogged with a lead-tipped whip. Now, for the first century people, you didn't have to explain what flogging meant. 2 Roman soldiers, a brutal whip called a flagrum, or cat of 9 tails, a short-handled whip with several leather strands, each strand tipped with pieces of bone, metal, or hooks. And the prisoner's hands were tied above his head, his body stretched out, and then the beating began. Each strike was counted out loud, because even the Romans had rules when it came to torture. They were masters of pain. Each lash didn't just tear the skin, it ripped through the muscle, sometimes even exposing internal organs. Many men died during flogging, some from blood loss, others from shock or infection. Many did die from Roman flogging, but not necessarily from the number of lashes, rather from the severity of the method. And that makes Jesus' survival after the flogging all the way to the cross so staggering. He endured a level of suffering most never survived, and he chose to go through it. Let's pause here for a moment. It's almost impossible for us in the modern world to imagine how cruel this truly was. And maybe the reason we struggle to grasp the brutality is because we heard this story. We heard it first as children. And you don't tell kids about blood and guts. So what we got was a PG-13 version, a sanitized and softened version. But now as adults, we must not wrap this scene with soft music and make it a spiritual moment, because it was nothing like that. To soften this part of the story is to miss the point entirely. The truth is, all of us would have looked away. Back to the brutal truth. The soldiers wove a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they put a purple robe over him, over his shredded raw back. "Hail, King of the Jews!" they mocked, and they slapped him across the face. Pilate went outside again and said to the people, "I am going to bring him out to you now, but understand clearly that I find him not guilty." Look at him, Pilate is saying. Maybe if they just see him, bloody, broken, beaten, they'll say, okay, that's enough, release him. Surely he's not going to survive the infection anyway. And if he is guilty, he would have confessed by now. He would have begged for mercy. He would have screamed for it to all stop. But he didn't. He was completely innocent. When they first saw him, the leading priests of the temple guards began shouting, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate responded, "Take him to yourselves and crucify him. I find him not guilty." Pilate had never seen anything like this before. So the Jewish leaders moved to plan B because plan A was taking too long now. They say, "By our law, he ought to die because he called himself the Son of God." When Pilate heard this, he was more frightened than ever, because now it wasn't just a Jewish issue. You see, in Roman culture, the title Son of God was reserved for the emperor, for Caesar himself. And suddenly this trial hits closer to home for Pilate. He took Jesus back into the headquarters again and asked him, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave no answer. And let this sink in. Pilate was a first century Roman soldier. He had climbed the ranks and he had seen everything: torture, war, execution. But then Jesus said nothing. This was the moment when most men broke down. Even the strongest warriors begged for a quick death. No one could withstand this kind of suffering. And Jesus, he's just silent. "Why don't you talk to me?" Pilate demanded. "Don't you realize that I have the power to release you or crucify you?" Then Jesus said, "You would have no power over me at all unless it was given to you from above." Wow. Pilate had seen the fear in men's eyes before, but now, for the first time, he looks into the eyes of a man who was fearless and sincere. So much so that then Pilate tried to release him, but the Jewish leaders shouted, "If you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who declares himself a king is a rebel against Caesar." Checkmate. They got Pilate where it hurt, his loyalty to Rome. When they said this, Pilate brought Jesus out to them again. Then Pilate sat down on the judgment seat. And he said, "Look, here is your king. Away with him," they held. "Away with him. Crucify him." "What? Crucify your king?" Pilate asked. "We have no king but Caesar," the leading priest shouted back. Any other time, that would have been considered blasphemy. But out of nowhere, the leaders of the Jews shouted that they have no king but Caesar. Then Pilate turned Jesus over to them to be crucified. So they took Jesus away. And then it's as if time stopped. What happened next needs no description. Then the soldiers nailed him to the cross. Crucifixion wasn't invented for death. It was designed for suffering. Invented by the Greeks, perfected by the Romans. The success of a crucifixion was measured by how long the victim could survive. My friend, this was not just a beautiful gesture from Jesus so we could be forgiven. This was brutal. This was horrific. This was done to many people, but only one person ever chose it. Let's say this clearly. The moment Jesus died, no one believed in him anymore. No one followed him. His disciples had ran away. Yes, there was sadness. Yes, some sympathized, but there were no believers left. Why? Because during his entire ministry, Jesus had talked so much about who he is, that he was bringing a new covenant, that he was the true Son of God, that he was the one to save Israel. Jesus said that he was the true life. But how do you kill the true life? How do you execute the Son of God? And how does a Messiah get killed by the very enemy he's supposed to defeat? So when Jesus died, he couldn't have been who he said he was, because Messiahs don't die. And how can new life come from death? The legs of the two thieves crucified with him were broken to speed up death. But when they came to Jesus, he was already dead. Just to be sure, a soldier pierced his side with a spear, and blood and water flowed out. And at that moment, Jesus was just a dead body, or so it seemed. Afterwards, Joseph of Arimathea, who had been a secret disciple of Jesus because he feared the Jewish leaders, asked Pilate for permission to take down Jesus' body. When Pilate gave permission, Joseph came and took the body away. With him came Nicodemus, the man who had come to Jesus at night. He brought about 75 pounds of perfumed ointment made from myrrh and aloes. Following Jewish burial customs, they wrapped Jesus' body with the spices in long sheets of linen cloth, because that is how you buried a dead person back then. When it was all over, just before the Sabbath began, they all went home. And I imagine then confused, broken, thousands of unanswered questions. While the others, the ones who crucified him, well, they slept peacefully that night. Caiaphas, he was content. He had achieved what he wanted. Pilate, relieved. Finally, it's done. By tomorrow, the crowds will head home and I'll get back to my peaceful life on the coast. Caesar Tiberius, well, he didn't even know what had happened. Everything was now back to normal, because everyone expected Jesus to do what dead people normally do: stay dead. But what no one knew, very soon history itself would be changed. A new way of living was about to spread across the entire world. What they thought was the end was actually just the beginning of something completely new for the world and for you. Love. The same love God had for the world through Jesus was now going to become visible through you and through me. And let's be clear, you need to hear this today. Jesus' kingdom is completely different from the kingdoms of this world. He was crowned through death. His new life began when the old way of life tried to destroy him. We cannot say Jesus is our King and still live according to the same systems that crucified him. We cannot follow Jesus and still live by the values of this world. Jesus is different. His kingdom is different. We are called to be different. In His kingdom, victory came through death. We need to die for our own selfish ambitions and sin. We must take on this new life Jesus established here on earth. And we need to become more like Jesus, the only true life.